Thank you so much, Claire. Well, we are joined now by Notre Dame Professor Kathleen Cummings. Thank you so much for joining us, who is here to talk with us all about the canonizations in Rome yesterday of Pope John the 23rd and Pope John Paul II. Now, Professor Cummings is an associate professor of American Studies at Notre Dame and the director of the university's Cushwa Center for the Study of American Catholicism. Now, her teaching and research center on the history of women and American religion and the study of U.S. Catholicism. Now, two former popes were actually canonized by Pope Francis yesterday during a 10 a.m. public mass in St. Peter's Square. And, you know, what is the meaning of that?
Canonizations are always grand events in the Catholic Church, but it's hard to match yesterday's. Four popes, a total of four popes participating in one way or another in the ceremony. What happened yesterday was that John Paul II and John the 23rd were canonized, declared saints by the Church. What that means is it doesn't make them saints, it confirms that they've been in heaven from the moment of their deaths. So while as Catholics we believe that any person in heaven is a saint, only canonized saints have had that process certified by the Church.
And what does it mean to have two canonized on the very same day?
It's unprecedented. There's never been a double papal canonization before, and we're unlikely to see one again. I think Pope Francis, it tells us as much about Pope Francis as it does about the two men that were elevated to the altars of sainthood. Pope Francis was interested in, as he's demonstrated to us in so many ways over the last year, he's focused on healing divisions within the Church. And for better or for worse, it's not entirely accurate, but John the 23rd is seen as a hero to more progressive Catholics, while John Paul II is seen as one to more conservative Catholics. And Pope Francis has said in other contexts that it's time to bring these factions of the Church together. And canonization can always be a highly symbolic act, and that's what he was doing in linking those two men.
And where do you think the focus was more on the two former popes that were being canonized or on Pope Francis? You know, where were people maybe focusing more?
Well, Pope Francis has shown that he can draw a crowd, but I think most of the people there were there for the people being canonized. You know, the first canonization I went to was in fall 2010 when Brother Andre Bessette, the first saint from the Congregation of Holy Cross, was canonized. And it's really an amazing experience. People cheer and they weep. It's a little bit like a sporting event, but yet it's also a very solemn occasion. So you could see in the crowd yesterday, there were people waving flags and cheering wildly.
How long does a mass like that last, or how long does the process last for?
Oh, well, the mass lasts for about 2 hours, but people start lining up hours and hours beforehand because it's really hard to get a seat.
So it truly is like sitting out waiting for tickets to maybe your favorite sporting event.
It kind of is, yes, in a lot of ways. And so many pilgrims had traveled to Rome for this event, particularly from Poland, to honor John Paul II, and people were sleeping out in the square. They had lined up for hours.
And then I know we're here at Notre Dame today. Is there any Notre Dame connections to what happened over the weekend?
Notre Dame connections to what? Well, in a sense, it tells us an awful lot about American Catholicism, and Notre Dame is connected to American Catholicism. I think that it, you know, our founder, not our founder at Notre Dame, but the founder of the Congregation of Holy Cross, Basil Moreau, his cause is reportedly very close, and I suspect that when that happens, that'll be a big Notre Dame celebration. Unfortunately, the process remains kind of secret until right at the end, so I don't have any inside information on that, but rumor has it that Basil Moreau is very close. And like the celebration for Brother Andre Bessette, it'll be a big one.
And I was going to ask, what is the process of canonization? How does this come about?
Well, it's interesting. Both of the men canonized yesterday, it would have been possible that we would have never had that moment. What I mean by that is that after each died, after John the 23rd died in 1963 and John Paul II in 2005, there were proposals to canonize them immediately. Santo subito in Italian, sainthood now. Let's bypass the process and just declare them a saint. In both cases, their successors decided to go through with the process, although it went rather quickly with John Paul II. Rather quickly, but all the steps were followed. In the case of John the 23rd, his second authenticated miracle was waived. Pope Francis decided to do that. What the process is, it's a detailed investigation of everything that the candidate wrote, everything that witnesses are interviewed about their virtues, their heroic virtues, and then the Vatican's Congregation for the Causes of the Saints verifies that they live lives of heroic sanctity and they're declared venerable. Then it's time to wait for miracles.
And for us here in the U.S. that maybe watched on TV or online or just read a few articles about it, what does it mean to be able to witness this in our own time setting, to see these two former popes canonized on the same date?
It means, first of all, anytime anyone is canonized, it's an occasion to celebrate that in canonizing someone, it doesn't mean that they were perfect or without sin, but it means that they did the best that they could and that they're in heaven. And that's a reminder for all of us that it's possible. If it's possible for them, it's possible for us. But I think, too, it tells us a lot about the last 50 years. We celebrate next year the closing of the Second Vatican Council, and it was the Pope John the 23rd, who called the Second Vatican Council, and then John Paul II, who implemented it in so many ways. So it was really a very momentous event from the perspective of Catholics in the United States, but really around the world.
And I know you said you're currently writing a book, I believe, as well. If you can talk about that some and what it's about.
Sure. I'm writing a book called Citizen Saints, Catholics and Canonization in America. And what it's about is that when you look at people who are canonized, as I said earlier, it tells you a little bit more about the people who are promoting the saint than it does about the man or woman actually being canonized. So when we look at the saints who have been popular in the United States, like Francis Cabrini, the first saint canonized from the United States in 1946, immigration was very important at that time, and it was a way to celebrate the United States immigrant heritage. John Paul II canonized more saints than all of his predecessors combined. He believed that there should be as many saints as possible because he understood that when you canonize someone from a population within the church that doesn't have a saint yet, it's very meaningful. And U.S. Catholics in 1946 were elated to have their first saint. Now, interestingly, John the 23rd beatified Elizabeth Ann Seton in March of 1963. It was one of his last acts before his death. And interpreters at that time described the event as the ecclesiastical equivalent of John Kennedy's election. In other words, Catholics had arrived. They had a Catholic president and a canonized saint.
And just from your perspective, looking at the weekend, what do you think, looking back at that and that celebration happening?
Well, it was a very emotional moment when the two popes embraced. There was a lot of question leading up to it. Was Benedict going to attend? What would it mean if he attended? Was he going to be well enough to attend? Would Pope Francis mention him in the homily? A lot of questions. And I think at that moment when they embraced, it was really meaningful and really just united 5 decades of church history in one moment. It was really very moving.
Professor Cummings, thank you so much
You're
for
welcome.
joining us here on this Notre Dame Day. How do you plan on spending the rest of yours this afternoon?
I'm going to listen and just enjoy. It's a great lineup.
Yeah, it's been wonderful here for us. And thank you again for
welcome.
joining us. And of course, from time to time,